journey from this very first lecture. And we are going to build some really cool applications, some real world examples, and some scalable applications where we use microservices and Kafka and whatnot. But this is going to be the very first lecture where we are going to set our foundational stone, like what Spring Boot is, what Spring Framework is. We are going to learn all about that in this class and also in this module. And then moving forward, we'll look at Spring Boot and how to create your scalable application in Spring Boot. But I think we have to learn about Spring Framework before that. So we are going to cover the basic concepts of Spring Framework, like what are beans, what are dependency injection, how the auto configuration really works, and why do we really need Spring Framework. I think that is the most important part that we have to cover before we move ahead with the Spring Boot framework. So let's just jump right in, and I'll show you with the help of some really cool examples that why do the developer really need Spring Framework. And don't worry, even if you have no clue like what Spring Boot is, you have no idea what Spring Framework is, don't worry, because this course is going to be a very beginner friendly course. We're going to cover everything from the very scratch so that you can understand everything. And again, this is the very first class, so I can't cover each and every concept in this class only. So what you have to do is just take a leap of faith. Just take a leap of faith, just understand whatever is being taught in this class and then move ahead with the next lectures and so on. Because it's the same thing with learning any programming language as well. Whenever you started learning Java, for example, you were bombarded with keywords like public, static, void, main, and lots of other stuff before you could even write your simple hello world program. And you had no clue like what all these keywords are doing right here. But as you progressed in your Java journey, you learned about each and every keyword, and now you know like what is the use of each and every keyword. And this is the same story with this Spring Boot as well. So we'll cover each and everything from the very basics, like what are beans, what is dependency injection, and then we'll move ahead. We'll use those things to create some bigger application and use the same concepts again to create even bigger application. So I hope all that is making sense right now. So let's just jump right in. So this is going to be a very introductory class. We're going to scratch the surface, like what is Spring Boot and why do we really need it. And then later on, we'll cover Spring Boot in great detail also. So let's just jump right in. So what is Spring Framework, right? Because Spring Boot and Spring Framework are not completely different. Spring Boot is actually built up on top of Spring Framework. So why did the developer needed Spring Framework first of all? Well, before Spring Framework, before 2003, this is the year when Spring Framework was first introduced by a person called Rod Johnson. Before 2003, developers were creating Java applications. They were building web services, some batch processing systems, some authentication services. They were building all that. They were using Java Enterprise Edition to do that. But the problem with that system was they had to configure a lot of stuff. So they had to configure their whole project before they even could write a single piece of business logic. And in some cases, it was taking them more than 2 months, more than 3 months. And that was not the ideal case. Right? That was not the ideal scenario at all. So developers were using something called Java EE, right? And it is a good programming language, right? Java is a good programming language. You can build scalable applications, but you have to configure a lot of stuff. By configuration, what do I mean? You have to configure your server, let's say, which server you want to use and how that server is going to work. And you have to consider your configure your databases. And not just that, you want to log something, you want to add authentication, you want to add some third-party libraries. You have to configure all of that before you can even write a single piece of code. Think of it like that. You are purchasing a house, right? You went ahead, you purchased a house, but you can't directly start living in that house. You first have to furnish that house, right? You have to do some interior designing. So that part is called configuration. So with Java EE, you have to buy the house, right? You got this framework, you got the house, but you also have to do this configuration before you even before you could move into the house or you could write your business logic. And that's where the Spring Framework came into the picture. And with Spring Framework, what you now got was not the fully furnished house just yet, but you got a helper, you can say, or butler, right? You got a butler. Now this butler will help you to configure this house, right? It will help you to configure all these libraries on your behalf, like however you want to configure those libraries. It would also help you to do some dependency injection work for you. We'll learn about dependency injection in the great detail. But yeah, this butler was really helpful and developers really loved it. Like this Spring Framework was really helpful. That butler in context of Spring Framework is actually the IOC container. So you get an IOC container in Spring Framework, and with the help of this, you get dependency injection, you get aspect-oriented programming, you get support for beans so that you can loosely couple your system and then you don't have to worry about your dependencies. So you get a lot of stuff, and you can configure all those stuff with the help of XML files, right? But still, developers were taking a lot of time to configure all those stuff using the IOC as well. So IOC is the inversion of control container. We'll look into that later on. But yeah, with Spring Framework in 2003, you got this IOC container, and now the thing that was taking them like 2-3 months, they could configure the whole application in, let's say, 7 days or 10 days. But still, it was not an ideal situation. So in 2014 came Spring Boot, and Spring Boot is actually built on top of Spring Framework only. Don't think of it as a separate thing. No, Spring Boot is actually built on top of Spring Framework. But with Spring Boot, you actually get a fully furnished house. You can think of it like that. That you get an application that is already configured with good enough defaults that you can start working on it. You get a good enough server defaults. You get good enough database defaults and a lot of other configuration as well. So with Spring Boot, you get starter dependencies from which you can just directly start your code, and you get auto configuration as well. So you get this IOC container, you can say the butler, and you also get a fully furnished house. You can say the auto configuration, those starter dependencies, so that your code was already configured with a lot of stuff, so that you didn't have to go ahead and configure all those stuff by yourself. And with the help of this, developers could directly start their application. They could just download the starter package, and they could just start writing the business logic from the very first day. And that was the power of Spring Boot. So in 2003, Rod Johnson created this Spring Framework, and in 2009, he sold it to VMware company. And then in 2014, VMware created this Spring Boot framework. And with the Spring Boot framework, developers now didn't have to configure their project. If they wanted to build some application, they could just do that instantly, right? So we'll look into how Spring Boot works and how the dependency injection, how the beans really work, what is this IOC container later on. But I think this analogy is making much more sense right now, like what was the scenario before 2003, before the era of Spring Framework, and how the things have now changed to when we are talking about Spring Boot, right? In Spring Boot, you don't have to configure lots of dependencies that I mentioned over here. Those are actually come directly pre-installed, or you can say auto-configured inside your application. So that was the power of Spring Boot. Now let's look at some official definition of this Spring Framework. So let's just look at Spring Framework for now. We'll look at Spring Boot in great detail later on, but let's just look at Spring Framework in this class. So for now, just understand that Spring is a dependency injection framework to make Java application loosely coupled. What is loosely coupled system? We will look into that later on anyways, right? So let's just leave it at that only. Spring Framework makes the development process easy for Java EE application. So developers were using Java EE, or you can say J2E, Java Enterprise Edition, to create their web services or multiple different kind of services. But with Spring Framework, it makes it easier to build those applications because you didn't have to configure them manually. You could configure them using the XML files, and then your Spring Framework, the IOC container that comes with Spring Framework, can take care of a lot of stuff on your behalf. So that makes the development process easy because the heavy lifting is actually being done by the Spring Framework. The Spring enables you to build application from plain old Java object and to apply enterprise service non-invasively to the POJOs. So we call them POJOs, plain old Java object, and you can create your whole your whole application that is actually very complex in manner, but that is actually built up of these POJOs, right? Plain old Java objects, and you can build your application with the help of these POJOs in Java programming language only. And you can also add the enterprise services like actuators, like health checks, metrics, and logging and security methods, and a lot of more other stuff non-invasively. Like your code didn't have to worry about any of those stuff because that was being taken care of by the help of the Spring Framework, right? So you can start building your own application, and you can have the support of some enterprise level services directly with the help of the Spring Framework. And then Spring was developed by Rod Johnson in 2003, and later on was acquired by VMware, and it is currently under the possession of VMware. And now you get a lot more developer support, you get good documentation, and a huge number of developers are now working on the Spring Boot framework. So you get a good support for documentation and a great community support in Spring Framework these days. So let's just look at the important components that the Spring Framework contains. So as I already mentioned, that Spring Framework contains a lot more mini frameworks, right? For example, you get a framework for testing. You get framework for core containers that contains the beans. We'll look at beans in the next lecture, and then core concepts, and then application context, and then expression language. One more thing I would like to stress upon is that you don't have to learn about each and every stuff because we are not dealing with Spring Framework anymore. We are dealing with Spring Boot, and Spring Boot has abstracted away a lot of boilerplate stuff that was actually being taken care of in Spring framework. So with Spring Boot, you have an abstract layer over the Spring framework that takes care of a lot of stuff. For example, this JDBC, you don't have to worry about this JDBC anymore. Even you don't have to worry about the ORM, because now with Spring Boot you get Hibernate, and on top of that you get Spring Data JPA. Similarly, you don't have to worry about this servlet, because that has already been configured inside our Spring applications. So we have actually some good abstract layer, and we can build our core business logic on top of these layers, and all the code underneath those layers have already been created by the good old developers at the Spring Boot organization. So let's just look at the important components that we are going to cover in this course. So first one is this core container that contains the dependency injection and the beans stuff. So that we'll look at this in the this coming module only. And then we have this AOP, which stands for aspect oriented programming, then JDBC, and then web, and then testing. So all these components are present inside our Spring Boot framework. That is the complete package, right? So we can build our application in the Spring framework, and we don't have to worry about configuring all these stuffs or writing the code for all this stuff, because that has been already created for us. Now let's just look at the IOC container that I have been talking about. So the IOC container is the core fundamental concept inside our Spring framework, and what it does is taking the control away from you. So sometimes you don't want to be in the control of your code, because the code can actually decide like how which piece of code should be executed. For example, when we're talking about event driven programming, when you click on a button inside your application, so some piece of code get executed, right? How does that happen? As a developer, you didn't define like at which moment this code should be executed, right? But there is some entity, something, some framework behind the scene that is taking care of all the events and then firing the code that corresponds to that event, right? So that part is called event driven programming, and that comes under the umbrella of IOC container. So you can think of IOC as a parent, and that has a lot of stuff. For example, I talked about EDP right now, which is the event driven programming. And then you have dependency injection. So you want to inject some dependency somewhere else, and you don't want to worry about the life cycle of all these dependencies, right? So you can use dependency injection that comes with the IOC container. You have AOP, which is aspect oriented programming, which is an advanced concept which we'll look in later part of this course. But all of that comes under the umbrella of this IOC container, and you don't have to worry about a lot of stuff when we are dealing with IOC container. How this IOC container is initialized when you run a Spring Boot application is that you configure your application, right? You can define your XML files, like how the different dependencies should be configured. You can define them inside your XML files, or you can also add some other metadata inside configuration metadata from your environment variables and some other property sources as well. And then you have your POJOs. This is the business logic. This is the piece of code that you have written. And with the help of these configurations, the Spring container can initialize your Spring application, or you can say it initializes the application context based upon these two things. And then it can inject the dependencies wherever they are required, and your Spring application just starts, right? So you can just change this XML, just change the environment variables here. Your code can remain the same, and now your code can be used for other environment altogether. For example, one environment could be your development environment, one could be your staging environment. All you have to do is just change the configurations, and now with the same piece of code, your application has been now initialized for a different environment altogether. So you get a loosely coupled system with this kind of approach, and that is only been possible with the help of IOC container, which contains dependency injection and a lot more other stuff. So in the Spring framework, let's just look at the official document definition. In the Spring framework, the IOC container is responsible for managing the component of an application and injecting dependencies into them. The container creates the objects or beans. We'll look at beans in the next lecture. Create the object of the beans, wires them together. That means it injects the beans whenever they are required, configures them, and manages their complete life cycle. So that is the role of this IOC container. And don't worry if all this is not making much more sense to you, because this is the introductory class anyways, right? So everything is not supposed to make sense right now, but as we move ahead in this course, you will see, okay, how these beans are being auto-configured and are being managed with the help of, and the life cycles are being managed with the help of this IOC container. So how all of that is happening under the hood, you'll look at all that stuff when we actually look at the code. So I think that is it for today's class, because that has been a good enough introduction to the Spring framework. And later on, we'll see how the beans work, that are the core concepts of the Spring framework, and also how the dependency injection works, right? So that is it for today's class. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.